At 30,000 feet above the Pacific, a single American fighter roared into a sky filled with enemies. 5 Japanese fighters closed in, confident, fast, and deadly. They believed this massive P-47 Thunderbolt was too heavy, too slow, and too clumsy to survive what came next. But within minutes, the sky would prove them wrong. This aircraft wasn't just metal and guns, it was a flying sledgehammer. By the time the smoke cleared, only one side would still be flying. This is the story of why they nicknamed his P-47 Meat Chopper. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe to the channel for more true wartime stories, and comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps keep these forgotten histories alive. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be graceful. It was massive, bulky, and heavier than nearly every fighter in the sky. Pilots jokingly called it a flying bathtub, but those who truly understood it knew one thing. This aircraft was built to survive hell. By late 1944, the Pacific War had become a brutal contest of endurance. American forces were pushing island by island toward Japan, and the skies were filled with constant danger. Japanese fighter pilots were experienced, aggressive, and willing to fight to the last drop of fuel. Among the American pilots was one man who trusted his machine completely. He wasn't famous, he wasn't reckless, but he knew exactly what his P-47 could do. The Thunderbolt carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, more firepower than many bombers. It could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. And most importantly, it could take damage that would tear other fighters apart. This pilot had already returned from missions with holes in his wings, shrapnel in his fuselage, and entire sections of skin missing. Yet the engine kept running. That engine was the heart of the beast, a massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine, pushing more than 2,000 horsepower, turning the P-47 into a blunt instrument of war. On this day, the mission was routine. Escort bombers patrol the airspace, return home. But war never stays routine for long. Radar warnings came first, then glints of sunlight off moving wings. 5 Japanese fighters climbed toward him. Lighter aircraft, tighter turners, piloted by men who believed speed and agility would decide the fight. They saw the P-47 and smiled. To them, this American plane looked like an easy kill. Too big, too slow, too confident flying alone. They didn't know the nickname yet. As the enemy closed in, the pilot didn't panic. He didn't try to outturn them. That would have been suicide. Instead, he climbed, higher and higher, pushing the engine to its limit, knowing exactly what came next. At altitude, the P-47 became something else entirely. Gravity was its ally. When the Japanese fighters finally attacked, they came in from multiple angles. Classic tactics designed to overwhelm. Tracers ripped through the sky. The Thunderbolt shuddered as rounds struck its armor. Warning lights flickered, but the engine kept roaring. Then the pilot pushed the nose down. The P-47 dropped like a stone. In a dive, the Thunderbolt was unstoppable. Faster than any Zero. Faster than fear itself. The pilot pulled the trigger. 8 machine guns erupted at once, sending a solid wall of lead forward. One Japanese fighter flew straight into it. There was no explosion, no dramatic fireball, just metal tearing apart. The enemy aircraft disintegrated mid-air, wings snapping off like paper. The others broke formation immediately. Now they understood. This wasn't a clumsy fighter. This was a flying buzzsaw. The sky became chaos, diving attacks, desperate climbs, sudden reversals. Every time the Japanese pilots tried to circle, the P-47 dove through them again, firing in short, controlled bursts. Another fighter fell smoking toward the ocean. The nickname spread quickly over the radio after missions like this. Pilots began calling his aircraft Meat Chopper, not because it was cruel, but because when it hit, there was nothing left to fight back. And the battle was far from over. The moment the first Japanese fighter fell, the balance of the fight changed completely. What had begun as a confident ambush turned into a desperate scramble for survival. The remaining 4 Japanese pilots were skilled. They had years of combat experience, many from China and the early days of the Pacific War. They knew how to coordinate, how to trap an enemy, how to force mistakes. But none of their training prepared them for the raw physics of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The American pilot stayed calm. He didn't chase recklessly. He didn't spray ammunition wildly. Instead, he controlled altitude. Altitude was life. Every climb was slow, deliberate, and painful, but every dive was pure dominance. The P-47 didn't dance in the sky. It fell through it. One Japanese fighter tried a head-on pass, trusting speed and nerve. For a brief moment, the 2 aircraft rushed toward each other at closing speeds exceeding 700 miles per hour. Most pilots flinched in moments like this. He didn't. At the last second, he fired. 8 machine guns spoke as one. The enemy aircraft flashed through the stream of bullets. When the Thunderbolt pulled up, the Japanese fighter was already gone. Not burning, not spiraling, simply erased. The radio crackled with warnings from friendly pilots watching from a distance. More bandits incoming, fuel was dropping, ammunition was limited. The pilot knew he had minutes, maybe less. The remaining 3 Japanese fighters tried a new approach. They climbed above him, hoping to reverse the advantage, hoping to drag the Thunderbolt into a turning fight where lighter aircraft ruled. The P-47 began to take hits. Rounds tore into the wings. Shrapnel punched through the fuselage. One bullet shattered the canopy glass, sending fragments into the cockpit. But the aircraft stayed steady. The Thunderbolt was built like a tank. Armor plates protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fire. Where other fighters would already be falling, this one kept flying. The pilot pulled into a shallow climb, just enough to bait them. The Japanese pilots followed. That was the mistake. He rolled inverted and dove straight down. The P-47 screamed as gravity took over. The airframe shook violently, but it held. One enemy tried to follow. He couldn't. The lighter fighter began to compress, controls stiffening, wings trembling. The Thunderbolt pulled away like a hammer falling faster than anything beneath it. Another burst of gunfire. Another enemy aircraft broke apart. Now there were only 2. They separated, trying to attack from opposite directions. Desperation had replaced discipline. The American pilot chose one and trusted his aircraft to protect him from the other. He rolled into the attack, firing in short bursts, conserving ammo. The enemy pilot tried to climb away. The P-47 caught him. Bullets ripped through the tail section. The fighter snapped into a spin and vanished into cloud below. Silence filled the cockpit. Only one Japanese fighter remained. He didn't attack. He pulled away, disappearing toward the horizon. The fight was over. In less than 10 minutes, 5 enemy fighters had challenged 1 Thunderbolt, and only 1 escaped. The pilot checked his instruments. Fuel was dangerously low, ammunition nearly gone. The aircraft was scarred, torn, and bleeding oil, but it was still flying. As he turned toward home, he looked over the wing. Chunks of metal were missing, control surfaces were damaged. Yet the engine continued its deep, steady roar. When he landed back at base, ground crews stared in disbelief. They counted the holes. They shook their heads. Other pilots gathered around, asking the same question. How did you survive that? He didn't boast. He didn't exaggerate. He just patted the side of the aircraft and said one thing. She brought me home. From that day forward, the nickname stuck. Meat Chopper. Not just for what it destroyed, but for what it endured. And the war was far from finished. The story of that fight spread quickly across the airfield. Pilots who had watched the battle from afar replayed it again and again in their minds. Not because it was flashy, not because it was reckless, but because it shattered everything they thought they knew about air combat in the Pacific. For years, Japanese fighters had dominated through agility. They turned tighter, they climbed faster at low altitude. They forced enemies into spinning, exhausting dogfights. The P-47 refused to play that game. What made the Thunderbolt terrifying wasn't finesse, it was momentum. Engineers had built it around a single idea: survive, dive, strike, and escape. Its enormous weight, once mocked, became its greatest advantage. In a dive, gravity turned mass into speed, and speed into absolute control. Pilots learned to fight vertically, not horizontally. Climb when you could, dive when you must. Never turn longer than a heartbeat. The pilot of Meat Chopper understood this better than anyone. He adjusted his tactics mission after mission, choosing patience over aggression, precision over chaos. Japanese intelligence reports soon reflected the change. American Thunderbolts were no longer easy targets. They were predators. Enemy pilots were warned to avoid high-altitude engagements, to break off if a P-47 entered a dive, to never underestimate its firepower. But war doesn't always allow caution. As the Allied advance pushed closer to Japan, air battles became more frequent and more desperate. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours in the cockpit. Against machines like the Thunderbolt, mistakes were fatal. The pilot continued flying escort missions, ground attack runs, and air patrols. Each sortie carried risk. Each return felt like borrowed time. One mission, flak tore through his wing, severing control cables. Another time his engine was hit, oil pressure dropping dangerously low. Yet again, the P-47 carried him home. The aircraft earned its reputation not just for destruction, but for mercy. It gave pilots a second chance when other machines would not. Back at base, ground crews painted kill markers beneath the cockpit. They didn't celebrate loudly. They understood the cost behind every mark. The pilot rarely spoke about the Japanese airmen he faced. He knew they were skilled. He knew they were brave. In the sky, there was no room for hate, only survival. As the months passed, newer aircraft entered the war. The P-51 Mustang took over long-range escort duties. Jet-age concepts began to form quietly in design rooms. Yet the Thunderbolt never disappeared. It adapted, it bombed supply lines. It strafed airfields. It shattered armored columns. It protected ground troops who never knew the pilot's name, but trusted the sound of that engine overhead. By the end of the war, the P-47 had destroyed more enemy aircraft on the ground than in the air. It became the most effective fighter-bomber in the American arsenal. And Meat Chopper became more than a nickname. It became a symbol. A reminder that strength doesn't always look elegant. That survival can be just as heroic as victory. That sometimes the heaviest machine in the sky is the one that brings its pilot home. When the war finally ended, the pilot flew his last mission quietly. No fanfare, no cameras. He stepped out of the cockpit, touched the worn metal skin, and walked away. The Thunderbolt would soon be retired, replaced, remembered only in photographs and stories. But in those minutes over the Pacific, when 5 fighters attacked and only one side endured, the legend was already complete. Long after the engines shut down and the skies grew quiet, the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt remained. Not in headlines, not in victory parades, but in the memories of the pilots who trusted their lives to it. For the man who flew the aircraft they called Meat Chopper, the war ended without ceremony. He returned home like millions of others, older than his years, carrying stories he rarely told. When asked about that day in the sky, he never spoke of skill or bravery. He spoke of preparation, of training, of trusting the machine beneath him. He understood something simple yet powerful. Air combat was not about domination. It was about survival. The P-47 embodied that truth. It didn't promise elegance. It didn't promise invincibility. It promised one thing only: that if the pilot did his job, the aircraft would do everything in its power to bring him back. Across the Pacific and Europe, Thunderbolts escorted bombers through flak-filled skies. They shielded ground troops from enemy fire. They absorbed damage that defied belief. Pilots climbed out of wrecked-looking aircraft, counting bullet holes, shaking their heads in disbelief. Many later said the same thing: "I shouldn't be alive, but I am." Historians would later debate which fighter was the greatest of the war. Arguments would be made for speed, range, or agility. But among those who flew it, there was no debate. The P-47 was a guardian, and in that brief, violent encounter with 5 Japanese fighters, its reputation was sealed forever. The Thunderbolt didn't win because it turned tighter. It won because it endured longer. It didn't chase glory. It waited. It absorbed punishment, and when the moment came, it struck with overwhelming force. That is why the nickname mattered. Meat Chopper wasn't a boast. It was a warning. A reminder that underestimating an opponent, especially one built for survival, can be fatal. Today, restored Thunderbolts sit quietly in museums. Their metal skins are smooth again, their guns silent. Visitors walk past them, reading plaques, snapping photos, moving on. You realize what those machines once endured. Viewers still imagine what it felt like to sit inside one, hearing bullets strike the armor, feeling the airframe shake, and trusting that the next second would not be the last. But for those minutes over the Pacific, history was written not by words, but by choices. By a pilot who refused panic, by an aircraft that refused to fail, and by a truth that war teaches again and again: survival is never accidental. It is built, engineered, and earned. If you listen closely to old veterans, they'll tell you the same thing. Victory fades, medals tarnish, but the sound of an engine that brings you home, that stays with you forever.